Welcome to the world now, your window to stories shaping the world. I am Theophilus Ilaba. President Samia Suluhu Hassan has been declared the winner of Tanzania's presidential election, securing another term in office amid days of unrest across the country. Announcing the result, the Electoral Commission said President Samia won 98% of the votes, nearly sweeping the 32 million ballots cast on Wednesday. International observers like Amnesty International have expressed concern over the lack of transparency and widespread turmoil that have allegedly left hundreds of people dead and hundreds injured. It is difficult to verify the death toll due to the shutdown of the nation's internet, but the government has extended a curfew imposed in a bid to quell the unrest. In Tanzania's semi-autonomous archipelago of Zanzibar, which elects in its own government and leader, incumbent President Hussein Mwinyi won with nearly 80% of the votes. Well, for a wider look into the outcome of Tanzania's election, a global affairs analyst, Dr. Jide Ojo, joins me from the Federal Capital Territory in Abuja. Thank you so much for joining us at this time.
It's my pleasure too.
All right, so the scale of the victory, 97% plus, and the exclusion of prominent opposition have raised serious concerns about the competitiveness and legitimacy of the election. How credible do you find the official results?
Typical African election. Two main opposition candidates were disqualified. One of them in detention. So the road was actually paved for victory for Samia Suluhu Hassan, the incumbent president and the first female president of Tanzania. You see, as an election expert, it is not an election day that matters most in an electoral process. It is the process leading to that election. Now, you have 16 candidates contesting with the incumbent, but they were just also run bench warmer of sorts. They couldn't even raise campaign funds. So she was more or less running against herself. So I'm not surprised that she won approximately 98% of the votes, because the two other candidates that should have given her a run for her money were either bad or imprisoned. And that is why the international observer groups have said that this election wasn't free and fair, because it was not competitive. And you could see that from Wednesday, when this election was held, the internet has been shut. Arrest of journalists, activists, political actors, candidates have been made, and there are reports that in the post-election violence that was witnessed, between 700 to 800 people have been killed. Even though United Nations Human Rights Commission said it had reported that just about 10 were killed, but even a life lost in an election matters a lot. It's not just the number. So the process of the election was flawed. One of the candidates, Tungu, who actually called for electoral reform, got disqualified and imprisoned. The other candidate, who is the second strongest opposition candidate, was also banned from the process. So it's just typical of what we've seen in several African countries. Côte d'Ivoire just had its own election. Similar occurrence took place. And this will not be the last. And that's why many people have said democracy is in reverse in many countries across the globe.
Talking about democracy being in reverse in many countries across the globe, especially many have said African democracy, Africa should find its own form of democracy. With all of this happening, do you agree to that?
Well, we've been talking about homegrown democracy for a very long time, but I just don't understand exactly what homegrown democracy, or maybe we should just determine that we want to go back to our monarchical system, because that's the homegrown democratic structure that I know of in history of Africa and many world countries. Many of us evolved from monarchical system where you have kings dominating empires being run by emperors. But we have since moved past that centuries ago. Should we go back to that? Or are we saying that we are isolating ourselves from the global best practice where one man, one vote no longer counts, where people, opposition elements are silenced, where there is shrinking civic space, where journalists cannot freely practice and ply their trade, where democratic institutions are routinely undermined? I don't think that is helpful to us in Africa if we want to say we are running against global best practices. Because for me, yes, people have said even China is a democracy, even though it's a de facto one-party state. People have widely condemned the election that was held in Russia under Vladimir Putin. But be that as it may, we have a global benchmark for conducting election. And I think it's not too difficult. It's not a rocket science to adhere strictly to that global benchmark, which is just ensuring that there's a level playing field for all the contestants, one man, one vote, make sure that the whole process is transparent, make sure there is proper accreditation, proper voting, let there be inclusive participation, let people with disabilities, youth, women, all of them should have their voice and their representation in governance structure. I don't think that is that should make us to want to back down or back out and say we want to have an homegrown democracy. Okay. It's just that our leaders across many African countries are self-serving and are just focused on personal aggrandizement. That's why we always check in ensuring that there are credible elections. Look at what has happened in Ghana. Since 1992, Ghana has been a global reference for credible election. And many of us, what are the Ghanaians doing right now other African countries could not do? Even South Africa is pulling its weight. So we have this oasis of credible elections, and we should just not shy. I think African Union, despite having a department of that oversees issue of politics, elections, and even security, I think African Union needs to do a lot more to ensure that we respect continental benchmarks and global benchmarks for credible elections. I don't think it's a rocket science. It's just that many African leaders are fixated on this sit-tight syndrome. Look at what happened in Cameroon. Just this last month, a 92-year-old man insisted on not leaving and conducted the shambolic election that have returned him to power. And where is the opposition? I just read yesterday that the main opposition candidate have fled the country to safety. So we cannot continue along this trajectory. I think with the African Union, the regional and sub-regional bodies need to really have conversation with African leaders to allow for credible elections. There are standards that we can adhere to that will not make us look like animals in the midst of other civilized countries.
All right, so looking at the election in Tanzania, what does this victory tell us about the current balance of power within Tanzania's ruling party, that's the CCM?
Well, incidentally, CCM has been in power for 64, 65 years now. And they are just like ANC that have also been the governing party in South Africa. And so what this victory meant for Samia is that it's status quo ante bellum maintained. They just want to maintain the status quo that the ruling party that has been there from independence from the time of Julius Nyerere is still the ruling party or in 2025. But there's nothing wrong about that if only you allow for level playing field. For me, I have issues with just disqualifying strong candidates on flimsy excuses. That's my grounds. Why don't you win fair and square? And the system in Tanzania is just first past the post. So it's not even very complex system where you say you must have 50 plus 1% as in several other African countries. And this is an election that happens every 5 years. So if you have first past the post and you are a ruling party, you've been there since the 60s, since independence, why can't you have that confidence that come what may, even if there are 200 opposition, you will still be victorious without undermining the process.
Okay.
So this whole issue of qualifying strong candidates is born out of palpable fear that maybe if they allow for credible elections, they will be voted out of power.
Okay, so looking at the victory,
an idea whose time has come.
Looking at this victory, of course, how do you think this might affect Tanzania's standing within the East African community and the African Union in general?
Well, I don't think it's going to vitiate or undermine the standing of Tanzania. We've seen worse elections across the continent, so there's nothing they will be ashamed of.
Okay.
Of course, all antagonism has been rebuffed as being the handiwork of political enemies. In fact, the government officials said they didn't kill anybody, nobody died. When the opposition elements are reporting that about 700 to 800 people died in several counties and communities. But as to the standing within the African Union and within the East African sub-region, I'm not sure, because they are in very good company. Look at Zimbabwe. Uganda, Kenya. Kenya is another bastion of democracy that have successfully been able to have credible elections. And just like I talked about Ghana, so Kenya have successful transition of power from one party to the other. And not just that, it's not just because they have had transition from one party to the other, it's because the international and local observers have adjudged those elections as being credible. We have had that also in Liberia. Look at how a sitting president, George Weah, was voted out, and the man accepted his fate. He was okay with just being a one-term president. Didn't use the executive power to run his opponents out of town. And the Liberian people prefer to have a 78-year-old man, John Waka, in his place. And it doesn't, it's unfazed. So what I'm saying is, in essence, is that the East African Union, African Union or the East African sub-region will just look on, and they cannot interfere because this is a sovereign country, and you cannot go and start running down another country's electoral process, maybe because it's my pleasure. Enjoy your month. Enjoy your weekend.
You too.
Have a wonderful day.